I'm Robert Winchell. I'm chair of the Trauma Systems Committee for the college and team leader for this consultation. And again, we'd first like to say thank you both on behalf of the Trauma Systems Committee and the college, the team, and personally for your hospitality, for the opportunity to come and take a look at the Virginia trauma system. We've really enjoyed our time here, and with that, we'll get started on the exit interview. So we always spend a little bit of time talking about the situation and where we find ourselves. So this is Virginia. You know Virginia far better than I do, having only really gotten to spend a lot of time here in the last little bit. You know, it's a land with a lot of contrast, from the very urban to the very rural, from oceans to mountains. You have some of the older college football rivalries here. 42,000, 43,000 square miles, that's 35th in size, 12th in population, 15th in population density. As you're aware, this was the first permanent settlement in North America in Jamestown in 1607. You were the 10th state to join the Union, 1788. The Old Dominion state is the most common nickname, referring back to the loyalty shown at the time, to England at the time that the king was deposed there by Cromwell. Sic Semper Tyrannis, the motto. Again, that one dates to the Revolutionary War. It's legendarily attributed to Brutus after slaying Caesar, but the contemporary accounts don't necessarily hold water on that one. The flowering dogwood is the state flower, the cardinal is the state bird. Any takers on the state drink?
Come on. Come on.
You know, you'd think that. You would think that, but in fact, the people who choose state drinks don't tend to be that bold, and so you all have chosen milk, which is right up there with about 27 other states. Alabama being the only one who's actually willing to demonstrate the true affinities and name whiskey. So looking at the current status of the trauma system, again, this is your CDC-related mortalities. Again, like the rest of the country, injury is the top or near the top of the list of leading causes of death for people under the age of 45. It's in the top 10. Again, very consistent with national norms. This is your distribution of age-adjusted death rates from, across the population. This is reflective of the county-level data that was presented at the opening interview. Again, that you've got a relatively high per capita mortality in the southwestern and more rural part of the state, a lower one in the more urban parts, which again is a very typical distribution of what we see in other states and across the country. Again, the transportation-related deaths, looking at the states in your immediate vicinity that border on Virginia, and again, you're significantly lower than most of those other states. Again, for reasons we don't really have the resources or the ability to get into why, Delaware is in fact on top of that list. But the good news is that you guys are already at the bottom of it, and undoubtedly all of the work that's been going on in trauma systems here over the past 30 or 40 years is at least somewhat contributory. This is trauma center coverage based on the distance from, ground or air from your level 1 and level 2 centers, including the 2 in Tennessee, one of which used to be in Virginia before they rebuilt the hospital, we've learned. But that accounts for the coverage, again, in the southwest corner of the state. This are your 11 EMS regions and the distribution of the hospitals. And this is how those regions overlie with the disaster and public health regions in the state. So Virginia, again, as we said, has a very long history of trauma system development. You were probably the first or second, depending on how you frame the bar argument, to actually decide about trauma systems and to start designating centers. The first one here being done in 1981. There are clearly a network of historically committed high-level trauma centers that have been in operation in Virginia for a long time, located like most other places in the urban centers, but really aligning with the majority of where your population lives as well. The system design, again, having been started in the very early parts of the trauma system world when in fact the thinking was all EMS based. In fact, your system is highly rooted in that historical model. It was suggested to us that that's because Virginia is big on history, and very well may be, but that certainly shows in the way the system is organized and the way it runs. you have a very good established funding source, probably in the top 5 or 10th percentile of states for how trauma systems are paid for. And in fact, your distribution scheme is a better one than I would say almost all of the places we've been. It does a pretty good job at getting the money out without creating too many adverse incentives for competition among the high-level centers. What we also found, however, there's not a lot of integration of the system components. That sort of is typical of the more historical model of how the system was developed. And Virginia, like a lot of places, has a legacy of local authority, and so you have 11 functionally autonomous EMS regions as far as the trauma system operation goes. There really isn't a trauma system plan. It was an EMS plan, and it's got a little add-on for trauma, but there's not a built-out and fully comprehensive trauma system plan. Again, based on its historic roots, the trauma system is highly focused on field triage and on identifying patients and getting them to trauma hospitals, but not so much on encompassing the other elements of trauma care. There's not a strong central guidance of the trauma system, and so most of the EMS destination decisions are in fact made at the very local level. EMS treatment protocols are very much made at the local level, and there's minimal system-wide process improvement currently. And that results in a high degree of variability in care from one end of the state to the other or from one EMS district to the other. Your data system is in the shop for upgrade, but at the moment it's out of service. And even when it was up, there has not been a lot of historical use of data to measure trauma system performance and to try and provide oversight to the trauma system. The model that we work from in developing our recommendations is an inclusive trauma system model that in fact evolved over time, 20 years almost, 10 years to 20 years after the Virginia trauma system was established. And it tends to look instead at injury severity as a continuum, where there are minor injuries on the left of this graph, which comprise actually the majority of the injured patients. And as you move to the right through minor and moderate and severe injury, in fact, your system and most of what people would tend to call exclusive systems really address only the high-end people, or the sort of the right quarter of the graph, which is where the intensity is, but not necessarily where the numbers are if you look at injury as a public health issue and a way to try and decrease the burden of injury on the population. So going back on the historical bent, this is the public health model. The outside 3 components of assessment, policy development, insurance come out of a 1988 IOM report. The inner 10 components followed in 1994. And the model that's in the model system, trauma system evaluation and planning guide, in fact, works from that 94 model and tries and graphs on the essential trauma pieces, trying to fit them into those 10 essential elements of public health. The idea being that, in fact, injury is best viewed as a holistic problem, starting with identification and epidemiology, just like you'd look at infectious disease, through different ways of developing policy around prevention, around tertiary care, and all those pieces, again, trying to look at the whole picture. Our priority and sort of our grounding element in how we render our recommendations really is the best interest of the patient, and having that transcend sometimes what might be the best interests of a particular group or a particular institution. And again, that being sort of the touch point that most everybody in the system can come back to. Advantages and assets, there are many. One, you have a very long history of dedicated participation of institutions, of trauma leadership, of people across the board, really from the pre-hospital through really every component of system care, that have been at this for a long time and continue to show a lot of energy in trying to make things better. You have an engaged group of stakeholders. There are most places that are trying to fill the seats on their trauma advisory board instead of actually having to try and make the board smaller to be able to fit the room. You have a very strong EMS community, one of the largest and strongest in the country. You have stable and engaged leadership in the Department of Health. Again, an endemic problem often is that there's a lot of turnover at the Department of Health, and it's hard to maintain an institutional vision and commitment. You have a very good volunteer recruitment and retention program. in an age when, in a state that relies fairly heavily on volunteers, in an age where volunteerism is hard to support. Again, we would say that your approach to trying to recruit and bring those people along is state of the art. Again, mentioned that you have substantial funding that comes from a stable source. It's not, reliant upon a line item that the legislature has to allocate every year. You have fairly good coverage of the population based on where your trauma centers are already placed. You already have fairly good access to population-based data for epidemiologic studies. You've got a broad underlying legislation which really gives you quite a bit of regulatory authority as opposed to more narrowly drawn states. So it's not too specific. At the same time, it really seems to provide you with most of the authority that you need. You've adopted the CDC field triage guidelines for identifying trauma patients. You have a long history with a trauma center verification process. We think the commitment to the new data system and the linkage with the EMS is a good direction to be heading, although it was sort of a big and I'm sure daunting step to take. The fact that your funding mechanism actually includes the potential to provide support for research from a monetary standpoint, as well as the data-driven components, is a strength. There's a strong statewide interest in pediatric emergency readiness, both reflected in your response to the hospital's response to the recent inquiry and the pediatric focus of many of our focus questions. And we also felt that the addition of a PI subcommittee to the Trauma System Oversight Committee is a strength. The next two slides are a little harder, because I would always feel there's sort of a sense of hubris in we as a team have walked into the state for a little over 72 going on 96 hours, and we're going to promptly tell you who've been working on this system for 20 years exactly what you got wrong and how to fix it. But I can only say that's why we're here, and understand that that's the spirit in which these are offered. So looking at what we perceive to be the challenges and vulnerabilities that you have in the current system. One is, in fact, a reliance on a historical model of system structure when most of what's gone forward suggests that there are advantages to be gained by a larger view of what trauma systems can do. There's a narrow focus on the field triage and getting the patients to the hospital that would do well, we believe, to be broadened to look again at the broader spectrum of injury. You have significant conflict between the necessity for central guidance and the reliance on, or the sort of affinity for local control, and trying to arbitrate that conflict. And based in large part on that conflict, and someone told me the other night that in Virginia it's better to be polite than right, this sort of hard to arbitrate the conflict, that there is in fact a lack of central standards around protocols that we would submit are part of the glue that holds a trauma system together and part of where the benefits of having a systematized approach come from. And that, again, results in a high degree of variability in care between regions. And typically that degree of variability, some is good, this probably exceeds what's optimal in terms of caring for the population. There's no overriding trauma system plan to guide you in making future changes. And that is reflected then in a lack of overall vision of where the system needs to go in terms of getting better. And you really have a better idea in this room than we do in the big picture of what things would benefit from change. As we mentioned before, there's a lack of integration of what are often very capable component parts, but we use the term silos often, the term cylinders was used here, but they often exist in relative isolation. The trauma center designation process isn't based on need, and that's a standard that we believe is very important, that it's not strictly a matter of can a center pass, but in fact, should they be a trauma center? And that's an element that's not present in your current process. You have a fairly immature process for monitoring system performance and how things are really working at a ground level. That includes a limited utilization of the available data to help guide those particular elements, and limited system-level process improvement. We mentioned before there's limited integration of rehab services in the back end of trauma care and getting people back to work and back to their pre-injury life. There's a heavy EMS focus that goes right back to the start of this as an EMS plan with trauma sort of as a coda. And so trauma as a program doesn't have as much visibility, and therefore we think that makes it hard to maintain some of the priorities. There's limited trauma staffing in the lead agency to accomplish all the things that you need to do, including running a verification program. There's just a lot of things to keep the lights on and keep those processes moving that's necessary to maintain the cohesion of the system. And there's as much as I'm a trauma center surgeon and a trauma center guy, and even in that I would tell you that the Trauma System Oversight and Management Committee is heavily loaded with trauma center representation. If you include the chair, 10 out of the 15 seats are trauma surgeons and trauma center people. And it often is of benefit to have a slightly broader, especially if you're trying to tell people what to do, to have a slightly broader representation on that committee. So the themes of kind of tying together the recommendations that will follow, again, the first two are tied together. A sense of history is really important, but change is an essential part of life and moving forward. And out of that, we think as a system and a group of stakeholders that you need to come up with a shared vision for where this system belongs in the next 5 and 10 years. Again, reflective, hopefully based on some of the ideas we have, but in fact based on what the stakeholder community in Virginia thinks is where this needs to go. The system structure needs to be updated. That trauma triage doesn't equal a trauma system. It's a component of the trauma system, but it's not the only piece. That an inclusive system is not, in fact, an unregulated system. Inclusive in the trauma center or trauma system vernacular means that all of the acute care facilities play. They're all in the system. Their capabilities are known. They follow a baseline set of protocols. It doesn't necessarily mean that they play at the level that they choose. In fact, it should be more at the level that the system requires. And it doesn't mean that they sort of can make up the rules as they go along. So, again, inclusive but not unregulated. There's too much variability right now in how trauma patients are cared for in different corners of the state. And that it can affect the quality of care. And to fix that, you need to establish some firm system-wide standards. The regionalization component is absolutely a strength, and it's a conception that needs to be held on to and nurtured. But regional control can't be absolute. There has to be a fundamental standard that everybody has to meet that then is tweaked based on regional resources and availability. But that floor, if you will, or that minimal set of cohesion that holds everything together really should be established even in a very strong regional system. So the more esoteric way to look at it, you do in fact have the authority in your statutes, in your regulations, in your rules. You need to use some of it. You have substantial resources and highly focused or functional components. You can use those to move the ball forward. Don't be held back by perceived barriers. Keep the public and the legislature informed of what a great job you're already doing. And that, that PR thing is, if you want to call it that, is important. That this is a publicly funded and a publicly supported entity that is an essential piece of the safety net, and it's easy for people to forget that. That's a lesson that's learned in many, many places. Try and use the data you have to make that while you're waiting for the data that you hope to get. But it's better to get off the ground with what you've got. And like everything else in the world, starting is the hardest part. So what follows then are going through our priority recommendations in more specific. We picked about the top 15 or so out of, I guess, what will come up to be 60 or 70 in the final report. We'll expect you to have them all done by 6 months from now. It's easy. And I'll provide some basic rationale, but the sort of more developed rationale will follow in the full report. And these are not based by priority as much as they're based by kind of the order of the sections in the report as you'll see it when it comes out. So under system leadership, first we thought to engage the Trauma System Oversight and Management Committee and its subgroups, again a broadly comprised stakeholder group, in the development of a vision for the progress and the future, where the Virginia trauma system ought to go. And then to engage the same committee in regular oversight of the trauma system function and a regular review of both operational data PI data to make sure that, in fact, the system is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Under the lead agency and human resources within the lead agency, we believe it would be good to establish a specific trauma performance improvement person within the lead agency under trauma. There's too much work for one person to keep going, we believe. And under the same light, we think that you'd benefit from having a dedicated trauma medical director position. Again, some people who can be the voice of the system all the time, you know, from the administrative side and from the medical side, and in terms of really providing that day-to-day continuity in the operational and the philosophical components. We believe that you have a great mechanism between your funding and your contracts with the individual regional councils that can, in fact, help to ensure compliance with the things that the system believes that they should be doing, and that you, in fact, should use that to tie their funding eligibility to a set of deliverables that are set up by the system, and that in order to stay in the money, you have to, in fact, meet the deliverables. That's how a contract works. And you already have the underpinnings to do that already. We believe also that the OEMS organizational structure should be rearranged to sort of make the trauma system more of an identifiable and a creature of its own, if you will, a system other than a single person, which is kind of how the org chart reads right now. In order to incorporate the positions we believe you should add, and again, to have a place, you know, that the trauma system lives. You need a trauma system plan. And we think one of the first undertakings, it's heavy lifting at some degree, but again, to bring together that broad multidisciplinary work group to come up using the model system, you know, planning and performance document or performance and improvement document to use as a template for the components that should go into that plan, but it should address not just the trauma triage pieces, but the entire spectrum of that wheel of confusion, if you will, but the entire spectrum of the elements in the public health model. Work that through with a set of priorities and timelines to keep it moving, because big projects sometimes don't. You'll obviously go through whatever it takes to get it reviewed, to make sure that all of the stakeholder groups buy in. But then to try and put that in place, and then once it's in place, realize it's a living document that should be revisited at least every 3 years or so, which is, again, sort of the national standard we aim to try and get folks on. In terms of coalition building and community support, use the information and the things that you know about, your data, your success stories, to make sure the public and the legislature know what the trauma system's doing for them and how important it is and why they need to keep supporting it and actually support it even more as time goes forward as part of building that community support. Under emergency medical services, we believe that you need to establish very specific regional destination guidelines for each step of the trauma triage. For level 1, level 2, level 3, that there needs to be a state template. It should say what hospital you're going to go to. That needs to be modified at the level of the region, but still there's got to be a floor of what it's there. And yes, to some degree it was related that the medic in the back of the truck is going to be the best person to decide where that patient goes. We agree with the qualification that that medic, like all of their other medical protocols, needs strong direction to guide them in making the decision the way the system believes it needs to be made. And then to follow these things along and, in fact, ensure that the guidelines are being followed regionally, that, again, that anything adapted regionally has to adhere at least to the minimum standard that's set by the state trauma system. We believe that along the same lines that you should work on a minimum set of statewide trauma, pediatric trauma, and geriatric trauma treatment protocols. Again, that will represent a floor of national best practices that regions are free to improve upon, but that they have to maintain at least. The other thing that we think would be helpful in all of this is to work on developing your resources for ground critical care transport, because you absolutely have challenges in how to get patients from relatively small regions with relatively few EMS resources, especially on days that helicopters aren't flying, and that some resources for ground critical care transport will be important there. Under definitive care facilities, we believe that you should establish a process that includes an assessment of need before you designate any new trauma centers. There's an evolving national standard. It's certainly, the college has a position paper out that we believe that that's the right answer. The hows of it are obviously locally derived, but you not only want to know that a trauma center can be a center, but that in fact, in the context of the system, that they should be a center. We believe that though your mission statement says that this is an inclusive system, it doesn't really function that way too much, and that most of how it's set up and the focus is on the higher level trauma centers, and that we feel you should go back to the inclusive center concept to make sure that you engage all of the acute care facilities. You already have them engaged in data collection, which is a big hurdle, but also to make sure that they, again, have a basic set of treatment and transfer protocols that say, no, they're not going to keep trauma patients, but it should be very clear how they're going to handle them, where they're going to go, and that those meet, again, a set of statewide standards. To get them involved in statewide PI, and in fact consider offering them technical assistance in doing that, whether in terms of specific visits to the hospitals, to look over their facilities, to deploying the RTDDC course, but something also to help them in carrying out the mission, because especially in the rural parts of the state, they are going to see trauma patients. They are going to see some of the people who are hurt pretty badly, and getting them into the inclusive system is important. And finally, your trauma center designation criteria follow the national standards pretty well. We believe they should be incorporated as administrative rules rather than simply part of your handbook. They may be incorporated by reference, but believe that they should have the authority of rule for enforcement. And again, that's pretty much the way things are done in most places. Under system coordination and patient flow, we think that you should consider, we think you should, in fact, decrease the number of EMS regions, and they probably ought to align with the current emergency preparedness regions. There's a lot of economy of scale with existing infrastructure, with existing flows, with integration with other agencies, fire and police, that makes sense to integrate with the trauma system. This is a recommendation we make in a lot of places. Here, that will also help you with controlling some of the variability in the regions, because the regional pieces are very, very important, but they probably should be a few less of them, and they probably should line up with your emergency preparedness regions. Under disaster preparedness, again, following the same theme, to strengthen the relationship with the Office of Emergency Preparedness, to make sure that the trauma system, so we would tell you that the emergency preparedness system should be built on the trauma system. If you can care for one patient a day or one patient at a time well, that's the same system that should be spun up to take care of a mass casualty. And that those offices are highly disconnected here. In many states, that's also true. And that, in fact, they really should be highly engaged and highly synergistic. And equally, to collaborate with the Office of Emergency Preparedness to maximize the use of the ASPR funding, and again, to sort of make use of what economies of scale you have and avoid duplication of effort in enhancing the surge capacity and how you care for mass casualty incidents. Under trauma MIS, we think it is a strong move to be forward-looking to implement this new system. Implementing new systems is never as easy as the vendor thinks it's going to be or as it looks like it should. And right now you're dead in the water because the system doesn't run. And so we think that it makes sense to try and contract with an expert in system implementation who can help make sure that the thing gets up and running in the minimum time, because you really want to be able to use the data that you can collect out of that new system and to have it do the things that it was put in place to try and do. And then following the same thought process, to develop a reporting mechanism that will allow for routine aggregation and reporting on this data that you generate to get out to the public, to policy-making officials, to legislators, again, to people, to let them know what the system is doing for them today, why their ongoing support is important for doing that. So that's the end of our sort of priority recommendation section. I will finish with some general observations about the process and what we've kind of gleaned from the states that we've been to. First, that our recommendations, again, are offered based on our broad general experience on the principles of a public health model, what we've seen in other places we've visited, realize that one size categorically does not fit all in trauma system implementation, and that the solutions are going to be reached by all of you, the stakeholders in Virginia, and that in fact the solution is going to be unique to the problems that you face here in Virginia. That change is never easy, that progress is a lot of work, and especially in such a multi-headed beast as a trauma system, it requires a lot of negotiation, a lot of commitment, and a lot of collaboration by a broad group of stakeholders. But that in fact the only solutions that are going to work are in fact going to be created by you, by that group. And so to finish off, we started with a Latin motto. My Latin is audentes fortuna juvat, which is fortune favors the daring. So with that, I'll offer up the chair to the floor to my team for their final closing comments. And again, my thanks. It's been a great trip. Drexel. Unfortunately, our pediatric / EMS representative had to leave a little bit early. He's working tonight for a living, they tell me. So.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us. This has been a real privilege and pleasure to be here to learn more about your system and what you do. Just from the number of people that showed up the other day and night and the number here today shows me that there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm into trying to improve the trauma system in the state of Virginia. And I appreciate that. I think you have what it takes to pull that together, and it's going to take you a while to get to some of these recommendations. I understand that because there's a lot of collaboration need to take place. But I do believe that you can get it done. And again, thank you for the invitation.
I want to thank everyone for being such gracious hosts, for working with us for the last couple of days and providing us with the information we needed to try to better understand the system. And we're hoping that we're going to give you some productive suggestions that will help out. I just want you to, recognize how fortunate you are. You've got the history, you've got relationships with each other, and I'm sure there'll be some relationships that get tested through the negotiation process that will move forward. But we certainly hope that we've given you some guidance. With regard to the pediatric issue, which I know you're very interested in, we will have much more substantial information to provide in the report. We got a couple of the pediatric issues we've woven into the priority recommendations, but there will be several other recommendations that follow.
Good afternoon. Again, I offer my thanks. The observation I wanted to make is I have had the pleasure of visiting and working in the Commonwealth of Virginia over the course of the past 15 years or so. The observation I have is you are incredibly fortunate to have really stable leadership at the Office of EMS. Again, Mr. Brown, Mr. Sharp, Mr. Winston have longevity that exceeds most state EMS officials, if you will. So that's really an important thing. But my challenge to those of you with the experience and the knowledge is that you welcome Ms. Pierce into the fold and that you make sure that she has the appropriate mentorship and support so that we can enjoy seeing her 10 years from now as well. I think she's a great asset, but she can't do it alone. Thank you.
So I just have a couple of comments. First of all, I'm very jealous of your funding. That's an enormous issue in many other states, including my home state of Massachusetts. We're perpetually going to the legislature every year. It's not stable. They always cut it. We're there with our placards, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm jealous because you've got unique and very strong funding. The other comment I would make is that some of the programs that you're doing at the local level are absolutely remarkable. And I use the word in our discussions of best practice. And some of those best practices, I'm not sure the public or your elected representatives are aware of. And I think that can be enlarged, because if Again, if the public realizes what you're doing and your elected representatives know what you're doing, that will help in the challenges you'll be facing in the years ahead. I really enjoyed my time here, and I thank you for your attention. Do you have something to say?
No? Oh, okay. So I just want to say thank you so much for your hospitality, and I really appreciate the participation from all of the stakeholders here. And more importantly, I appreciate the candor during our open town hall sessions. I want to make a comment about the pre-review questionnaire. Completing the pre-review questionnaire is a huge job, and I think you all did a really good job of pulling it together. And obviously the rest of the stakeholders here and the trauma program managers contributed, but thank you so much for pulling that together. We pour through it and we read every line of every document. I also want to commend this group, the trauma leadership and the EMS agency. It's a very mature system, and I believe that it takes a lot of courage to open yourselves up to one of these system surveys. Might be a little bit scary, but my hope is, and my belief is that the report that we give you can help move you into the direction that y'all want to move in. And finally, I just want to say thanks to my colleagues and friends and everybody here in the room and everybody that works within the trauma system for the patient care that you provide and your dedication and commitment to the trauma system. And thanks to my colleagues for letting me hang out with you for a week.
So that's what we have as a presentation. Are there any questions or clarifications from the audience? Or last thoughts?
Just on behalf of the Virginia Department of Health and the Commonwealth, thank you.
Well, again, our pleasure entirely. Yes?
I just want to support it. You seemed a little nervous before you gave us our recommendations.
Oh, no.
Spot on. Very good.
We have a metal detector and we look for rotten fruit at the door. Plus, I'm very quick. So, no.
Very good.
All right, well, again, thank you very much then, and look forward to great things from Virginia.